Normandy, France, June 18, 1944. 3:40 hours. The soldiers' hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from the cold. The summer night was warm, almost suffocating. Not from fear of the enemy. The German lines were 2 miles east, temporarily quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. Private James McKenna, 22 years old, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, sat in a makeshift tent 50 yards behind the front lines, trembling so violently that the tin cup of coffee someone had pressed into his hands sloshed onto his mud-caked boots. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept. 3 days? 4? The faces of his dead friends played on repeat behind his eyelids every time he closed them. A medical officer approached, not to punish him, not to call him a coward, to save him. What happened next would shock the Axis powers and revolutionize military psychiatry forever. While German and Japanese forces considered mental breakdown a sign of weakness worthy of execution, the Americans had discovered something extraordinary. The human mind, like the human body, could be treated, healed, and returned to battle, often within 72 hours. They called it PIE, proximity, immediacy, expectancy. 3 simple principles that would keep more American soldiers fighting, preserve more sanity, and challenge everything the enemy believed about warfare and the human spirit. This is the story of how America won a war not just with bullets and bombs, but with something the Axis never expected: compassion at the front lines. A revolutionary approach so effective that it would return 60 to 80% of psychologically wounded soldiers to duty, soldiers the enemy assumed were broken forever. This is the story of the method that saved minds while winning battles, and how the simple act of treating trauma as temporary rather than permanent became one of the most powerful weapons in the American arsenal. North Africa, February 1943. The Kasserine Pass. Captain Bernard "Bernie" Weinstein had seen wounded men before. In his 4 months as a battalion surgeon, he'd amputated limbs, extracted shrapnel, sutured wounds that should have been fatal. Blood didn't bother him. Screaming didn't bother him. But the soldier in front of him now, that bothered him. The man was physically intact. No visible wounds, no blood. But he sat on the ground, knees pulled to his chest, rocking slowly back and forth, eyes fixed on something 1,000 miles away. His lips moved soundlessly. When Weinstein touched his shoulder, the soldier exploded into violent trembling, scrambling backward like a terrified animal. "How many like this?" Weinstein asked the corpsman beside him. 17 in the last 6 hours, sir. 23 yesterday." Weinstein felt something cold settle in his stomach. The 1st Armored Division had just survived one of the bloodiest defeats in American military history. Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had smashed through Kasserine Pass with brutal efficiency, killing over 600 American soldiers and capturing 3,000 more. But these numbers, the ones sitting in rows behind the aid station staring at nothing, unable to speak or stand or hold a rifle, these weren't captured or killed. They were simply gone, vanished into some internal landscape of horror that Weinstein couldn't reach with bandages or morphine. In the German camp 20 miles south, Oberst Friedrich von Weber received a very different kind of report. The captured Americans, his intelligence officer explained, included numerous psychiatric casualties, men who had simply broken under pressure. Von Weber nodded with grim satisfaction. This confirmed what German military doctrine had always maintained. The Americans were soft, undisciplined, weak. They crumbled when faced with real warriors. The entire concept of combat exhaustion was nothing more than an elaborate excuse for cowardice. In the Wehrmacht, von Weber told his staff officers that evening, such men would face a firing squad. The Americans send them to rest camps. This is why they will lose. He had no idea how wrong he was. Washington, D.C., Office of the Surgeon General. January 1942. Major Frederick Hansen had a problem with numbers. Not mathematics. He'd been an excellent student at Johns Hopkins Medical School. No, his problem was with a different kind of calculation, the arithmetic of broken minds. World War I had produced 159,000 American psychiatric casualties. The U.S. Army had handled them by shipping them far from the front lines, often back to the United States for lengthy hospitalization. The theory was humane: remove the traumatized soldier from the source of his trauma, provide extended rest and treatment. The results were catastrophic. Only 2 to 5% of these men ever returned to duty. The Army had essentially converted temporary psychological injuries into permanent disabilities by treating them as such. Hansen spread the British and French reports across his desk. The Europeans, after 4 years of grinding trench warfare, had stumbled onto something remarkable. When they treated men close to the front lines immediately after breakdown with the expectation of rapid recovery, the results were dramatically different. The French called it immediate proximity treatment. The British refined it into doctrine. By 1918, they were returning 60 to 80% of psychiatric casualties to active service. "We're going to do something the Army won't like," Hansen told his small team of military psychiatrists. "We're going to tell them that mental breakdown isn't a disease. It's a normal reaction to abnormal stress. And we're going to treat it like a sprained ankle, not a character flaw." Lieutenant Colonel William Menninger, one of America's most respected psychiatrists, leaned forward. "The old guard will say we're coddling cowards." "The old guard," Hansen replied, "doesn't understand that the human mind is just another organ. You don't court-martial a man for getting shot in the leg. Why would you punish him for getting shot in the brain?" They began drafting what would become Technical Bulletin 12, issued in March 1943. The document was revolutionary in its simplicity. It established 3 core principles: proximity, immediacy, expectancy, and created a new category of treatment facilities called division psychiatry, located within artillery range of the fighting. Proximity: treat men as close to the front lines as safely possible in specialized neuropsychiatric centers just behind combat zones. Don't evacuate them far from their units. Immediacy: begin treatment within hours, not days or weeks. The longer a soldier remained in the patient role, the more likely his condition would become chronic. Expectancy: make it clear from the first moment that this is temporary. You're not sick, you're exhausted. You will recover. You will return to your unit. This isn't permanent. The method was elegant. No complex therapies, no lengthy psychoanalysis. Just 3 elements: rest, food, and the powerful psychological message that this was a temporary setback, not a life-altering catastrophe. Sleep, hot meals, and someone telling them they're not crazy, Menninger summarized. "That's it?" "That's it," Hansen confirmed. "The mind heals itself if you give it the right conditions. We're not curing mental illness. We're treating exhaustion, physical, emotional, spiritual exhaustion from experiencing things human beings weren't designed to experience." Sicily, July 1943, 3rd Battalion Aid Station. Captain David Marcus had been a psychiatrist for 7 years before the war. He'd treated depression, anxiety, schizophrenia in the comfortable confines of private practice in Boston. Nothing had prepared him for this: a tent that smelled of antiseptic and fear, the constant rumble of artillery, and a steady stream of men whose minds had simply stopped. The first one arrived at 1400 hours. Sergeant Paul DiMaggio, decorated veteran of North Africa, found wandering in circles 300 yards from his foxhole, unable to remember his name or recognize his own commanding officer. His unit reported he'd been functioning normally until a German 88mm shell landed 30 feet away, killing 3 men instantly. Marcus applied PI protocol. First, proximity. DiMaggio was already here, close enough to hear his battalion's guns. Second, immediacy. Treatment began immediately. A corpsman led DiMaggio to a cot, gave him hot soup, administered a mild sedative. Third, expectancy. Marcus knelt beside the cot and spoke clearly, firmly. "Sergeant, you're experiencing combat exhaustion. It's temporary. Your mind is protecting you by shutting down. We're going to let you rest for 24 to 48 hours. You'll eat, you'll sleep, and then you'll rejoin your unit. This is not permanent. Do you understand?" DiMaggio's eyes flickered with something: confusion, relief, hope. 18 hours later, DiMaggio was sitting up, eating breakfast, asking about his men. 36 hours later, he was back with his unit. He would go on to fight through the Italian campaign and survive the war. Marcus documented everything meticulously: date, time, symptoms, treatment, outcome. By August, his records showed a 73% return to duty rate among psychiatric casualties. 73%. The old evacuation and hospitalization method had achieved 5%. Word spread through the medical corps like electricity. This worked. It actually worked. Part 4, The Enemy's Blindness, Germany. Wehrmacht High Command. October 1943. General Oberst Franz Halder reviewed intelligence reports with growing contempt. The Americans, it seemed, had established rest centers immediately behind front lines for soldiers suffering from Nervenbelastung, nerve strain. They were treating combat exhaustion as if it were a legitimate medical condition requiring immediate intervention rather than harsh discipline. Weakness, Halder muttered to his adjutant. They validate weakness. They tell their soldiers it's acceptable to break down, so naturally they break down in greater numbers. The German military had a different approach: denial, punishment, and shame. Soldiers who exhibited symptoms of psychological breakdown were considered cowards unless they had visible physical wounds. The concept of Kriegsneurose, war neurosis, was officially regarded as an excuse rather than a diagnosis. Treatment, when offered at all, involved weeks or months of hospitalization far from the front, often accompanied by lectures on duty and honor designed to shame the soldier back to function. In practice, many German soldiers who broke down psychologically simply never reported it. They suffered in silence, or their officers dealt with them through unofficial channels, often violently. The official statistics looked good. Germany reported far fewer psychiatric casualties than the Allies. But the reality was different. Men were deserting, committing suicide, or simply becoming non-functional without ever appearing in medical records. Japanese military doctrine was even more extreme. The concept of combat exhaustion didn't exist in official terminology. A soldier who could not fight was a soldier who had failed his emperor, his ancestors, his nation. The shame was unbearable. Many chose death, by enemy fire or their own hand, over the dishonor of psychological breakdown. The Americans think they can win a war by being soft, Halder concluded. They will learn otherwise. England. May 1944. Neuropsychiatric Center, 29th Division. The building had been a schoolhouse before the war. Now it served a different kind of education, teaching broken minds how to be whole again. Lieutenant Sarah Hartman, Army Nurse Corps, watched as Private Robert Chen stumbled through the door, supported by 2 medics. He'd been pulled from his position during a training exercise, screaming about mortars that weren't there, attacking other soldiers he'd hallucinated as German infiltrators. His company commander wanted him court-martialed. The battalion psychiatrist sent him here instead. "Welcome to the reset button," Hartman said gently, guiding Chen to a bed. "You're going to eat, sleep, and remember that you're stronger than you think." The center operated on a precise schedule, refined through months of trial and error. Hours 0 to 4, arrival, assessment, immediate care. Hot food, regardless of appetite. Mild sedation if needed. Clean clothes. The message repeated constantly. This is temporary. You will recover. Hour 4 to 24. Sleep. Deep. Medicated if necessary. Uninterrupted. The body repairs itself first, then the mind follows. Hour 24:48. Awakening. More food. Gentle conversation, not therapy. Reconnection with the present. What day is it? Where are you? What's your unit? Gradually answers come more easily. Hour 48 to 72. Activity. Light exercise. Letters home. Time with others who'd been through the same experience. The understanding that you're not alone, not unique, not weak, just human. By hour 72, the psychiatrist conducted a final evaluation. Could the soldier return? The criteria were specific. Can he follow orders? Does he understand where he is? Can he sleep without nightmares? Can he hold a rifle without shaking? Robert Chen returned to his unit after 68 hours. He'd go ashore at Omaha Beach 3 weeks later. Part 6. Normandy, the Method Under Fire, France. June 1944. Omaha Beach. The PIE method faced its ultimate test on D-Day and the brutal weeks that followed. The scale of trauma was unprecedented. Men watched friends torn apart by machine gun fire. Fire stepped on corpses in the surf, fought through hedgerows where death came from every direction. The psychiatric casualties flooded in. Hundreds, then thousands. Captain Marcus, now a major, had moved his neuropsychiatric center to a farmhouse 3 miles inland. Artillery shells screamed overhead constantly. The building shook with each nearby explosion. And still, he treated men according to PIE protocol. "Major, we need the space," a harried surgeon told him on D+3. "We've got sucking chest wounds out here, amputations, men dying." These guys, he gestured at the psychiatric patients. They're taking up beds. Marcus stood his ground. These men will return to combat in 48 to 72 hours. Your amputees won't. Every soldier I send back is one we don't have to replace from the States. We're not just saving minds, we're maintaining combat strength. The numbers proved him right. By July 1944, neuropsychiatric centers across Normandy were achieving return-to-duty rates between 50 and 85%. The variation depended on intensity of combat, but the average held at 65%. Compare this to evacuation to England rates. Less than 10% of those soldiers ever returned. Private McKenna, the soldier from our opening, the one who couldn't stop shaking, spent 52 hours in Marcus's care. He slept for 18 hours straight, ate 6 hot meals, talked with other men who'd survived the beach. When Marcus evaluated him, McKenna could hold a rifle steady, could remember his squad leader's name, could think about returning to combat without collapsing into terror. "I'm not going to lie to you," Marcus told him. "Going back will be hard. You might break down again. But right now, today, you're fit to serve. Your unit needs you, and I believe you can do it." McKenna returned to the front. He survived the war. In 1989, at age 67, he wrote a letter to the Veterans Administration. "That doctor saved my life twice. Once by keeping me from being evacuated home, which would have destroyed me with shame, and once by making me believe I wasn't broken forever." France, August 1944. Captured German positions. As Allied forces advanced, they discovered evidence of how the Wehrmacht had handled psychological casualties. Or rather, how they hadn't. Intelligence officers found diary entries from German soldiers never meant to be read by command. "Hans has not spoken in 3 days. He rocks back and forth in his foxhole. The lieutenant says if he doesn't snap out of it, he'll be shot for desertion. We all pretend not to notice. I cannot sleep. When I close my eyes, I see the faces of the children in that village, but I cannot tell anyone. They would call me weak, unworthy of the uniform. Better to swallow it down, let it poison me from inside. Miller put his pistol in his mouth last night. The report said, 'Killed in action.' We buried him this morning. The Hauptmann forbade us to speak of it." The American military psychiatrist analyzed captured German medical records and found a striking pattern. Official psychiatric casualty rates were incredibly low, less than half the American rates. But unexplained deaths, desertions, and killed-in-action reports showed suspicious patterns. Men were breaking down. They just weren't being counted, treated, or saved. A captured Wehrmacht medical officer, Major Ernst Hoffmann, was interviewed by American psychiatrists in September 1944. The conversation, preserved in declassified documents, is revealing. American psychiatrist: "How did you handle soldiers suffering from combat exhaustion?" Hoffman: "We didn't use that term. A soldier either functioned or he didn't. If he couldn't fight, he was removed from the line." American psychiatrist: "Removed to where? For what treatment?" Hoffman: "Often to rear area hospitals. For weeks or months. Sometimes they never recovered." American psychiatrist: "Did you ever treat them near the front lines? Immediately?" Hoffman: "That would validate their condition, make them think they were truly ill. No, we believed the separation from combat was the only solution." American psychiatrist: "So you treated them the way we did in the last war?" Hoffman: long pause. "Yes." American psychiatrist: "And how many returned to duty?" Hoffman: "Very few, perhaps 1 in 20. American psychiatrist: "We returned 3 out of 4. Hoffman, incredulous: "Impossible." American psychiatrist: "Not impossible, just different philosophy. We tell them they're temporarily exhausted, not permanently broken. We treat them like wounded soldiers, not defective machines. And they believe us, because it's true." Part 8. The Pacific Theater. A Different Kind of Hell Philippines. October 1944. 32nd Division Psychiatric Center. Captain James Nakamura, Japanese-American psychiatrist from Seattle, faced a unique challenge in the Pacific. The fighting here was different, more primitive, more personal, more psychologically destructive. Soldiers fought at knife range in jungle darkness. They discovered bodies days after death, decomposed in tropical heat. They faced an enemy who considered surrender shameful and often chose suicidal attacks. The psychiatric casualty rates in the Pacific ran higher than in Europe. sometimes twice as high. But the PI method adapted. Nakamura established his center on Leyte, in a cleared section of jungle half a mile from active combat. The sounds of battle were constant: rifle fire, grenades, screaming. Yet this proximity was essential. Men needed to hear those sounds to realize they could exist in that acoustic environment without collapsing, to prepare mentally for return. The biggest difference here, Nakamura wrote in his monthly report, is the nature of the trauma. In Europe, men are broken by artillery, by mechanized warfare, by industrial-scale killing. Here, they're broken by intimate violence, by jungle claustrophobia, by fighting an enemy they've been taught is subhuman, but who proves terrifyingly human. The recovery requires different emphasis, more focus on processing specific violent encounters, less on overall exhaustion. The return-to-duty rate in Nakamura's center averaged 58%, lower than European rates, but still dramatically better than the evacuation model. More importantly, the soldiers who returned showed measurably better long-term psychological outcomes. A 1946 study would show that soldiers treated via PI method had significantly lower rates of chronic PTSD than those evacuated far from combat. Iwo Jima, March 1945. Captured Japanese field hospital. When American forces overran the Japanese field hospital in a volcanic cave system, they found something that stunned the medical personnel. Not a single psychiatric patient. Out of a garrison of over 20,000 Japanese soldiers who'd endured the most intensive bombardment in Pacific history, not one was officially treated for combat exhaustion. This absence wasn't because Japanese soldiers were mentally tougher. Evidence suggested the opposite. American intelligence had intercepted letters from Japanese soldiers expressing psychological anguish, nightmares, panic, despair. But these men never sought help because seeking help meant admitting weakness, which meant dishonoring everything they'd been taught to value above life itself. The result was a hidden epidemic. Japanese soldiers suffered in silence until they either died in battle, committed suicide, or stopped functioning entirely. The lack of treatment infrastructure meant that psychological collapse, when it came, was total and irreversible. Lieutenant Colonel Shiro Watanabe, captured during the battle, was interviewed by American psychiatrists. His testimony, translated and preserved, provides haunting insight. I watched men under my command lose their minds. They would stare at nothing for hours. Some whispered to people who weren't there. Others simply stopped moving, stopped eating. We had no way to help them. The concept didn't exist in our medical doctrine. So they died, in combat, or by their own hands, or slowly from neglect. I estimate I lost 20% of my command to what you call psychiatric casualties, but none are recorded as such. They are listed as killed in action, or missing, or dead from disease. The truth was too shameful to document. Watanabe paused, then asked the American psychiatrist a question. "You really returned these men to combat? They function again?" "Most of them, yes." This would be seen as impossible in the Japanese military. A broken spirit cannot be repaired. "That's where you're wrong," the American replied. "A spirit isn't broken. It's exhausted. Give it rest, food, and hope, and it recovers. Just like a broken bone." Watanabe later wrote in his war memoir, published in Japan in 1953, "The Americans understood something we did not, that caring for the warrior's mind was not weakness, but wisdom. We sacrificed thousands of men to an idea of honor that left no room for human fragility. They saved thousands by accepting that even the strongest mind has limits. I wonder how many of my men might have survived if we had learned this lesson sooner." Belgium. December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge. The PI method faced its greatest challenge during Germany's last major offensive. The speed and ferocity of the attack, the bitter cold, the complete surprise, all combined to create psychiatric casualties at a rate unseen since D-Day. Major Marcus's neuropsychiatric center was overrun in the initial German breakthrough. He and his staff evacuated with their patients 22 men in various stages of recovery, retreating 12 miles under fire. They set up again in an abandoned factory, this time with the German lines advancing toward them rather than stabilized behind them. "PI requires proximity," Marcus explained to his exhausted staff. "If we evacuate these men farther back, we lose expectancy. They start thinking of themselves as permanently damaged. We stay close or we lose them. For 3 weeks, as the Battle of the Bulge raged, Marcus's team treated an average of 45 new patients per day while evacuating recovered soldiers back to their units. The conditions were brutal. Inadequate heating, limited food, constant threat of capture. Yet the return-to-duty rate held at 62%. One patient, Lieutenant Thomas Morrison, was brought in on December 20th after his entire platoon was killed in an ambush. He'd survived by hiding under corpses for 6 hours. When found, he was catatonic, unable to speak, move, or respond to commands. Standard evacuation protocol would have sent Morrison to England, then probably back to the States. Career over. Life permanently altered by the label of psychiatric discharge. Instead, Marcus applied PIE. Morrison slept for 22 hours, woke to hot soup and a psychiatrist who said firmly and kindly, "Lieutenant, you experienced something no human should experience. Your mind shut down to protect you, but you're safe now. You will recover. This is temporary." After 48 hours, Morrison could speak. After 72 hours, he could smile. After 96 hours, somewhat longer than average, but still dramatically faster than evacuation, he returned to a reconstituted unit. He led that unit through the Rhine crossing. He survived the war and became a high school principal in Ohio, where he worked for 34 years. In retirement, he wrote, "Those 4 days in that freezing factory saved my life, not just physically, but spiritually. They refused to let me believe I was broken. So I wasn't." Part 11, The Numbers Tell the Story, European Theater. May 1945. War's End. The final statistics compiled by the Office of the Surgeon General revealed the full scope of what PIE had accomplished. Total psychiatric casualties treated in European theater, 232,000 percentage returned to combat duty via PIE method, 68% percentage returned to some form of military service, 84% average time from breakdown to return to duty, 3 to 5 days, percentage of returned soldiers who completed their service without re-breakdown, 79%. Compare this to World War I. Total psychiatric casualties evacuated from front lines, 159,000 percentage returned to any military service, 4% average time from breakdown to disposition, 6 to 18 months. The difference was staggering. PIE had essentially created 158,000 additional combat-effective soldiers, the equivalent of 8 full divisions, simply by treating psychological wounds as temporary and treatable rather than permanent and disabling. The economic impact was equally significant. Evacuating a soldier to the United States and providing long-term hospitalization cost an estimated $15,000 per man in 1945 dollars. Treating him near the front lines cost approximately $200. The total savings, nearly $3.5 billion. But more importantly, 158,000 men returned home without the stigma and disability of psychiatric discharge. They went on to have careers, families, normal lives, lives that would have been drastically different if they'd been labeled mentally defective and sent home in disgrace. Part 12, The Post-War Legacy United States. Veterans Administration Hospital, 1946. Dr. Bernard Weinstein, the battalion surgeon who'd seen those first cases of combat exhaustion in North Africa, now worked at a VA hospital treating veterans. He noticed something remarkable. Soldiers who'd been treated via PIE method showed significantly lower rates of chronic PTSD than those who'd been evacuated far from combat. The data was clear. Men treated near the front lines who'd returned to service and completed their tours adjusted better to civilian life. They had fewer nightmares, less substance abuse, better employment outcomes. The immediate treatment had prevented the psychological wound from becoming infected, metaphorically speaking. "We stumbled onto something profound," Weinstein wrote in a 1947 paper. "By treating mental trauma immediately and close to its source, we prevented the formation of permanent psychological scars. It's like cleaning and stitching a wound immediately versus letting it fester for weeks. The second option always leads to worse outcomes." The PIE method influenced civilian psychiatric practice for decades. The principles: immediate intervention, treatment in least restrictive environment, expectation of recovery, became standard in crisis psychology. When someone experiences trauma today, whether from combat, disaster, or personal tragedy, the clinical response echoes PIE. immediate support, minimal disruption of normal life, strong expectation of resilience. Part 13, The Human Cost of Neglect, Germany. 1947, interview with former Wehrmacht soldiers. American military psychiatrists studying the effectiveness of different national approaches to combat stress interviewed German veterans about their experiences. The contrast with American experiences was stark and heartbreaking. Ernst Fischer, former Unteroffizier, 352nd Infantry Division. I stopped being able to sleep after Stalingrad. When I closed my eyes, I saw the frozen bodies, heard the screaming. But I told no one. To admit this would be to admit cowardice. Instead, I drank. We all drank. Schnapps, vodka, anything we could find. It was the only way to make it through. After the war, I learned that 6 men from my company killed themselves within 2 years of returning home. Not in combat, after, because we carried the war inside us with no way to let it out. Hans Krieger, former Lieutenant 2nd Panzer Division. American soldiers would talk about their rest centers, their neuropsychiatric care. We mocked them for this. We thought it made them weak. Now I understand we were the weak ones, weak in our understanding of the human mind. We lost thousands of men not to enemy fire, but to despair, suicide, and madness that could have been prevented. The Americans were warriors who understood that protecting the mind was as important as protecting the body. We understood only punishment and shame. The German military's official psychiatric casualty rate was less than half the American rate. But their suicide rate during and after the war was nearly 4 times higher. The men who broke down psychologically in the Wehrmacht simply disappeared from statistics into unmarked graves, into civilian populations where they suffered in silence, into asylums where they were hidden from view. Part 14, The Method Refined Korea. 1950-1953, the next test. When America went to war again in Korea, the PI method went with it. But this time, lessons from Lobbyahit refined the approach further. Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, MASH units included psychiatric sections as standard equipment. The proximity was even closer, often just half a mile from active combat. The immediacy was measured in hours, not days. And the expectancy was reinforced with peer support. Recovered soldiers would talk to new patients, living proof that recovery was possible. The results exceeded even WBI2 numbers, 73% return to duty rate overall, with some units achieving 85%. The method had been perfected. Lieutenant Colonel Albert Glass, chief psychiatrist for the 8th Army, wrote in 1951, "We've learned that the human mind, despite its incredible fragility, is also incredibly resilient. Given the right conditions, safety, rest, food, hope, it can recover from almost anything. The key is to intervene before the trauma calcifies into permanent damage. Every hour counts. Every reassuring word matters. Every meal, every hour of sleep, every moment of human connection is a tool for healing." Part 15, Reflections from the Survivors' Various Locations. 1995-2000, 50th Anniversary Interviews. As World War II veterans reached their 70s and 80s, many reflected on the PIE method that had saved them. James McKenna, 73, former private, 29th Infantry Division. "I was completely gone, lost. If they'd sent me home in that condition, I'd have been a wreck for life. Instead, they gave me 48 hours, hot food, and someone who believed in me. That doctor, I never even learned his name, he looked me in the eye and said, 'You will recover.' And I believed him. That's all it took. Someone believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Robert Chen, 74, former private, 29th Infantry Division. "The Army taught me something profound in that recovery center, that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up. They didn't shame me for breaking. They fixed me and sent me back. That lesson shaped my entire life. When my business failed in 1963, I remembered that recovery center. When my first wife died in 1981, I remembered. You can always get back up." Thomas Morrison, 76, former Lieutenant, 101st Airborne. 4 days. That's all it took to save my life. 4 days of sleep, food, and someone telling me I wasn't permanently broken. Compare that to the alternative, months or years of hospitalization, a psychiatric discharge, a lifetime of disability payments, and shame. The PIA method didn't just save the Army manpower. It saved me from a life of thinking I was defective. How do you measure the value of that? Conclusion: the revolution in understanding the present day. Lessons that echo across decades. The PIE method represented a revolutionary shift in how militaries understood the human mind under extreme stress. Three simple principles: proximity, immediacy, expectancy, challenged centuries of thinking about mental breakdown as character flaw rather than treatable injury. The numbers are impressive: 68% return to duty, billions saved, divisions worth of manpower preserved. But the deeper legacy is philosophical. PIE established that psychological trauma is normal, not aberrant. The human mind has limits, and reaching those limits under extreme stress isn't weakness, it's biology. Context matters more than constitution. Most psychiatric casualties weren't men with pre-existing mental illness. They were ordinary people subjected to extraordinary circumstances. Remove them from those circumstances, provide basic support, and most recovered naturally. Expectation shapes outcome. When soldiers were told they were permanently broken, they became permanently broken. When told their condition was temporary, it usually was. The mind conforms to the story we tell about it. Immediate intervention prevents chronic problems. Treating trauma quickly prevented it from becoming permanent. This principle now governs how we approach all forms of psychological crisis. Compassion is compatible with military effectiveness. The Germans and Japanese saw humane treatment of psychological casualties as weakness that would encourage more breakdowns. The Americans proved the opposite. Treating men humanely made them stronger, more loyal, more willing to return to danger because they knew the Army would care for them if they fell. The Axis powers, with their emphasis on punishment and shame, lost not just the war, but the battle for understanding human nature. They believed that denying psychological trauma would make it disappear. The Americans understood that acknowledging it was the first step toward healing it. Today, when first responders receive critical incident stress debriefing after traumatic events, when disaster survivors receive immediate counseling, when the military maintains combat stress control teams in every theater, all of these interventions trace their lineage to those improvised tents behind the Normandy beaches, those field hospitals in the Philippine jungle, those frozen factories in Belgium. The PIE method taught the world something the Axis never learned, that the strongest military force isn't the one that never breaks, but the one that knows how to heal. That true resilience isn't the absence of vulnerability, but the capacity to recover from it. That caring for the warrior's mind isn't coddling, it's strategy. Private James McKenna, sitting in that tent in Normandy at 0340 hours on June 18, 1944, couldn't stop shaking. Within 52 hours, he was back with his unit. Within 70 years, he was a grandfather telling his story to researchers studying the method that saved him. He died in 2003, age 81, having lived a full life that an earlier age would have stolen from him with a psychiatric discharge and a lifetime label of mental defective. The Germans were right about one thing: the Americans approached warfare differently. But where the Wehrmacht saw weakness, there was actually wisdom. Where they saw coddling, there was compassion that doubled as combat effectiveness. Where they saw broken men who should be discarded, the Americans saw exhausted soldiers who could be restored. The PIE method didn't just help America win World War II. It revolutionized how humanity understands and treats psychological trauma. Those three principles, proximity, immediacy, expectancy, are now embedded in crisis intervention protocols worldwide. They've saved countless lives in contexts far removed from warfare, after natural disasters, terrorist attacks, accidents, personal tragedies. The ultimate irony is this: the Axis powers, in their contempt for weak American psychiatry, never realized they were watching the future of military medicine. They mocked the Americans for treating combat exhaustion as legitimate. They sneered at the rest centers near front lines. They maintained that true warriors never broke down, and those who did deserved no mercy. They were wrong. And the cost of that wrongness was measured not just in lost battles, but in lost lives. Men who could have been saved, should have been saved, but were instead abandoned to suffering because their commanders couldn't distinguish between strength and rigidity, between discipline and cruelty, between honor and humanity. The American method, born from pragmatic necessity, refined through careful observation, proven through remarkable results, stands as testimony to a simple truth that treating human beings with dignity and compassion isn't incompatible with military effectiveness. It is, in fact, essential to it. 75 years later, the soldiers who experienced PI are nearly all gone. But the method survives, evolved into modern combat and operational stress control, crisis intervention, and trauma-informed care. Every time a firefighter receives counseling after a terrible call, every time a soldier gets immediate support after a traumatic mission, every time someone in crisis is told, "This is temporary, you will recover," the ghost of Major Frederick Hansen smiles, and the legacy of those improvised field hospitals lives on. The Americans didn't just defeat the Axis with superior industrial capacity, better logistics, or tactical innovation. They defeated them with something far more powerful, the understanding that the human spirit, like the human body, can be wounded, treated, and healed. That recognizing this truth isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And in the end, wisdom won the war. Boston, Massachusetts, 1989. A letter never sent. Among the personal papers of Major Bernard Weinstein, who died in 1991, his family found an unsent letter dated November 11, 1989, Veterans Day. It was addressed to the German medical officer I never met. The letter was never sent because Weinstein had no name, no address, only a memory of reading captured German medical reports in 1945. But the letter captures the essence of what PIE represented. Dear colleague, we were enemies once. Your soldiers killed mine. Mine killed yours. That was war. But there was another battle we fought, one against an invisible enemy that respected no flag, wore no uniform, and killed without mercy. That enemy was trauma, the breaking of the human mind under unbearable stress. We fought this enemy differently. You treated it as weakness to be punished. We treated it as injury to be healed. You hid your casualties. We documented ours. You believed that acknowledging psychological wounds would create more of them. We learned that ignoring them guaranteed they would become permanent. I don't write this to gloat. We stumbled upon PI almost by accident, building on British and French lessons from the last war. Had circumstances been different, perhaps your military would have discovered these principles instead. But circumstances weren't different. And so we saved tens of thousands of our soldiers, while tens of thousands of yours suffered needlessly. The tragedy is that we weren't really enemies in this battle. We could have shared knowledge, compared methods, learned from each other. But war makes monsters of us all, and so your soldiers died in silence while ours learned to speak about their wounds. I spent 4 years treating broken men. I learned that there's no such thing as a weak soldier who breaks under stress and a strong soldier who doesn't. There's only human beings subjected to varying degrees of hell with varying degrees of support. Every man has a breaking point. The difference is whether we catch them when they fall or let them shatter on impact. Your military believed that harsh discipline would forge stronger soldiers. Ours learned that compassion created loyalty stronger than fear ever could. A soldier who knows his army will care for him if he breaks will fight harder, longer, and with less hesitation than a soldier who knows breakdown means disgrace. Perhaps the greatest lesson of PI is this: strength and vulnerability aren't opposites. They're partners. The strongest warrior is the one who can admit he's reached his limit, receive help, and return to battle. The weakest is the one who pretends he has no limits until he shatters completely. I wish we could have taught each other these lessons before millions died. I wish your army had given its soldiers the same chance at recovery we gave ours. I wish the word psychiatric casualty had been translated the same way in German and English, not as cowardice, but as wounded. But perhaps it's not too late. Perhaps future militaries will learn what we discovered in those tents behind Normandy, that caring for the mind is as important as caring for the body. That psychological first aid saves lives just as surely as surgical intervention. That the strongest armies are the ones that refuse to discard their wounded, whether those wounds are visible or invisible. We were enemies once, but we shared the same vulnerability, the same capacity for trauma, the same need for compassion. Your soldiers deserved the same care mine received. I hope the next generation of military physicians on all sides remembers this. With respect for our shared humanity, Bernard Weinstein, M.D., Major, U.S., Army Medical Corps, retired. The letter was found in an envelope marked, "Never send, they know." But perhaps Weinstein was wrong. Perhaps they didn't know. Perhaps they still don't know. Not fully. Perhaps that's why his family chose to donate his papers to the U.S. Army Medical Department Museum, where researchers still study the PIE method and wonder at the simple revolutionary idea that saved so many minds at war. The Americans discovered something the Axis never did, that the strongest weapon in warfare isn't the one that breaks the enemy. It's the one that repairs your own soldiers so they can fight again, and again, and again. That weapon was called PI, and it changed warfare forever.